Rust, rust, rust. It's everywhere, and it's a nice easy subject to cover for this video. I've got a go-to rust recipe using a few specific paints, but this is the sort of tutorial you can approximate with other paints since rust is pretty variable in colour. You can also go mad with extending this one for realism, so we'll start simple and I'll go to town on a final fifth example so that you can see how far it can be taken. I'm priming these Necromunda sculpted bases since they lend themselves pretty well to rust and dry brushing, but you can apply this rust technique anywhere really. You'll also see me use a similar finish on the overgrown terrain tutorial that I did a while ago. The primer I use here is called Mr. Finishing Surfacer 1500, but I want you to notice that I've not gone for maximum coverage. In some cases it's just a dusting, and in my mind the point of the primer isn't necessarily coverage, but more to create a surface for paint adhesion. Anyway, first up, the core of this tutorial is 3 to 4 brown to orange colours and a silver. You layer from dark to light on the browns and then you dry brush the silver over the top. So let's do that first with my AK paints. In this first one I'm using Hull Red, Medium Rust and Light Rust, but I've also done the same with a set of 3 Tooth and Coats paints and a set of Life Colour paints which are designed for rust specifically. The browns can be as messy as you like, it's really not super important, but consider going lighter, maybe in the areas where you think dampness might collect and pool. I'm using my Cryptic cabin size 4 brush for this. Any brush will do the trick, provided that it's big enough. For the bottom layer, I tried to get good coverage, so I kept the paint quite thick. A little water, but really not much since I was fine with this being slapped on like a toddler applying makeup. Whether or not the first layer dries is of no consequence to me since this is about speed here. If you have the time to waste, feel free to let it dry, but you'll see that I didn't always do that, so what starts to happen is a degree of wet blending, and actually I quite like the variation happening as a result of that. Hi, Editor Alex here. I know you don't see my face in this video, this is all you're going to get, but I'm just going to let you know I'm going to let all 3 of these bases that I'm painting be painted in full on camera. So you feel free to speed the footage up. It's a few minutes for each, but I wanted you to see how the paint was being applied and the kind of textures and the brush strokes and all that kind of stuff. I've not really cut any of that out. Hopefully that is okay with you. But yeah, just trying that as something maybe a little bit new. I didn't want to cut out all the crap. Anyway, back to the video. Round 2 is with Duncan Rhodes's Too Thin Coats paint range. The colours I picked here were a little more on the blue side for those first 2 coats, and you can see me once again bashing the paint on pretty recklessly. The paints that I used for this round in order were Too Thin Coats Scorched Earth, then we had Fur Cloak, and then we had Rust Orange. The third set of paints, which are normally my go-to for rust because of how lovely and matte they are, come in these stupid little pots which I hate. They have screw lids and for whatever reason they get all gunked up round the rim, something awful, and you can see by the time I get to the third pot here I have to essentially perform a colonoscopy to get the paint out, so I'll probably look at decanting them into dropper bottles when I can be arsed. The paints in question this time around are by Life Colour, and they are the Diarrhea series. The Diorama series. The first one is Dark. No. The first one is Rust Dark Shadow. Jesus. The second one is Rust Base Colour, and the third one is Rust Light Shadow 1. Anyway, once they're dry, it's time for the finishing touch, or I guess the next step if you plan to do more to your rusty bits. We're going to take a silver, I'm using a darker silver here, but probably any silver will do, and dry brush it lightly over the top. My Vallejo metal coloured jet exhaust has seen better days, so obviously whenever I use it, it seems to splash and piss everywhere, so just be careful with these bottles. I drop some onto a bit of kitchen towel here, then I use my Cryptic cabin medium-sized dry brush to take some, wipe off most of the metal colour, and then lightly dry brush each of the three bases. Instant rusted metal. Yes, I should have turned the palette camera off for this, sorry about that. But that is a great shot of my knuckles though, right? Now I'm going to show you a fourth base using Dirty Down Rust. If you're enjoying this, please consider giving it a wee like or hitting subscribe, since it helps me get the videos out to more people and encourages me to keep creating. Okay, so Dirty Down Rust, which doesn't really work on a black base, it just goes kind of black, as I found out the first time that I filmed this, so I figured I'd give one of these bases a coat of this leaking ass Vallejo metal colour jet exhaust. With more on my hands than on my palette, I splooged some onto this abused little metal tin and I covered the base with that. So, I'm not going to lie, the shit is smooth as anything. The metal grain size is so small because the paint's really aimed at airbrushing, but this means that you get this super delightful coat without any of that goopiness that you normally get in other metallic paints. Do the bottles end up spaffing paint all over your hands? Yes. Is it worth it? Yes, probably. So I shook up my bottle of Dirty Down Rust, and this stuff needs to be shaken, like a 5-year-old tin of coconut milk shaken, or like you're home alone and you haven't rubbed one out in 3 months kind of shaken. You get the idea. Being lazy, I figured I'd just bash some out into that same container with the metal colour, but it started mixing with that silver and having some mad reaction that you can see there, so I used what I could to cover the base with a decent coat, and then, like some rust-crazed junkie, just started dipping straight into the bottle. With the help of a hairdryer, I blasted this dry and then I gave it the Drybrush treatment just like the other three. So what happens with that Dirty Down Rust is it seems to oxidize and react as it's drying, and you get this quite variable rust texture and colour. What we have now is 4 bases, 3 painted with 3 paints, and then dry brushed, 1 painted with Dirty Down Rust, and then dry brush, and that is often good enough to pass as rust, and actually probably more than you need for gaming bases. Of course you'd want to do the rims in black, but you get the idea. And actually, if you're in a hurry, that could realistically be it, and for these 4 bases I'm leaving them as they are. But let's extend the process both at the start and the end, and we'll see how much we can add to this 5th base. First up, you could start with texture. Something like Typhus Corrosion has kind of a sandy texture to it, which will help with some variation and roughing up that surface. Now, obviously for some insane reason, the person that I bought this bottle off figured that Typhus Corrosion was a good paint to put into a dropper bottle, so I had to clear the nozzle since sandy paint and small holes do not mix. Anyway, you can see I just peppered it on here randomly, and this will give us kind of a rougher texture in those parts. Then onto the browns. I'll grab the 3 that I like the best for our base tones and just bang them on, but definitely wait until the texture has dried before you do this part. And then maybe now we go in with a yellow. So this one from Life Colour, despite being in maybe one of the worst paint pots ever, is a nice kind of punchy, light, rusty yellow. I made sure to thin this more so that it was kind of somewhere towards a wash texture or consistency, so that it collected a little bit more in the corners and the recesses when I was putting it on. And then I thought I'd add a more intense orange. Something like Citadel's Riser Rust Drybrush colour would be an easy candidate, just to make it a bit more punchy in certain areas. Now this is normally a Drybrush paint, but I went probing on in there with my brush and got some wet enough paint to splash onto the base. You might find a better non-Drybrush orange for this. As I said before, it's not really an exact science what colours you used. So then I dry brushed it in the same way as the other bases had been, and after that I decided to run a coat of Agrax Earthshade in there to knock some of this back a little bit.
I know I shouldn't be in love.
Now this got me feeling like there could be more, maybe in the way of moss or green colours in there. So I picked up a couple of AK greens, olive green and alga green, and watering them down I added some careful spots of green that were connected so that it felt like some moss or indeed algae growing in there. The slight colour variation of course brings a little bit more of a natural feel. And then for further variation I slopped on some Athonian Camo Shade, which is Citadel's dark green kind of army green wash. Now you could even try for kind of wet oily spills. I used a glossy Nuln oil here and I watered it down slightly before I dotted on some spots and then leaving them to dry. I felt like one last dry brush would be worth a shot, and this time I grabbed Vallejo Metal Colour Steel, which, to be honest, should have been a slightly lighter metal, but whether it was or not, who knows. Either way, at least the bottle didn't splash all over my hands. I gave the base a final brushing with that, and I figured that would be about us. Now, at this point you could get even more creative with pigment powders or moss and flock if you wanted to keep going, but I didn't want to venture too far from regular water-based or acrylic-based paint application here. Ultimately, the core of this is simple brown to orange with that silver dry brush. How you add your own flair, that is up to you, but hopefully this has given you some ammo with which to explore yourself. Until next time, bye-bye.
Unexpected.